Hey, my name is Wes Turner. I'm 35 years old, and 8 months ago I moved back to the small town I'd spent my whole youth swearing I'd escape, driving a rented truck with everything I owned in the back, which was mostly books. Unsold books. Boxes and boxes of them, because for 6 years in the city I owned a little independent bookshop called the Dog-Eared Page. And I loved that shop the way you love a thing you build with your own hands. And then the rent tripled, and the big river of online everything rose a little higher every year. And one gray Tuesday I turned the sign to closed for the last time, and I sat on the floor of my empty store and understood that the dream I'd left Millbrook at 18 to chase had officially, quietly died. So I came home. Not triumphant, the way I'd always pictured coming home. I came home the other way, the way the town watches for. The boy who left with big talk crawling back at 35 to sleep in his Uncle Ray's spare room and figure out what a man does with the wreckage of the one thing he was sure of. I'll be honest with you, I was not in a good way. I'd cataloged myself as a failure, filed it, believed it. I told anyone who asked, and plenty who didn't, that I was just regrouping, that I'd be back on my feet and gone again by spring, that Millbrook was a pit stop and not a destination, because if I admitted I might stay it would mean admitting the city had beaten me for good. A man will build an entire personality out of the word temporary if it saves him from the word failed. I was good at it, too. I could work the word into any conversation inside of a minute. The lady at the post office asked how long I was in town, and I said just till I get back on my feet, like it was a season and not a verdict. Ray, my uncle, who took me in without a single question and never once made me feel like the charity case I was, would offer to clear a shelf in the garage for my things, and I'd say, "Don't bother, I won't be here long," and I watched something flicker in his face every time. Because Ray had lost his wife 3 years back and knew a thing or two about men who keep their whole lives in boxes so they never have to admit where they live. The one decent thing in my days that winter was the coffee at the Bluebird Diner. The Bluebird sits on Main Street with a hand-painted sign and vinyl booths the color of a robin's egg, and it's been run for 30 years by a woman named Dot Kowalski, who is roughly 5 feet of opinions in an apron. And every morning I'd walk down and take the stool at the end of the counter and read a beat-up paperback and drink coffee I couldn't really justify spending money on, because the shop was warm and nobody there knew me well enough yet to feel sorry for me. And every morning, the coffee was poured by a waitress named Rosa Marquez. Rosa was maybe 28, dark-haired, quick with a comeback, with a smile she gave the whole room, and a different, realer, more tired one she saved for the moments she thought nobody was watching. I noticed the realer one because I had one just like it. She'd top off my cup without asking and say something dry about whatever I was reading, and I'd say something dry back. And it became the reliable good minute of my day, the way a warm exchange with a near stranger can be when the rest of your life is boxes of books in your uncle's garage. I didn't let it be more than that. I was temporary. Remember, I'd built a whole man out of the word. But I looked forward to that counter more than I let myself admit, and I'd caught Rosa's realer smile aimed at me once or twice. And I'd filed that away, too, in the drawer where I keep things I'm not brave enough to want. I knew a little of her story the way you learn things in a small town, by osmosis and Dot. Rosa had grown up 2 towns over and come to Millbrook a few years back, and there'd been a fiancé, a serious one, right up until there very suddenly wasn't. Some ugly business the winter before I came home, where the man left in a way that made the whole town wince on her behalf. And I knew, because Dot mentioned it while refilling the sugar, that Rosa's mother called every few days from 2 towns over with a fresh, eligible bachelor lined up and a running commentary on the ticking of clocks. And that Rosa had gotten so worn down by the worry and the setups and the pity that she'd finally, in a moment of weakness on the phone one night, told her mother she'd met someone. That she was, in fact, seeing a wonderful man, that it was getting serious, none of which was true, It was a small lie told to buy peace, the kind we've all told, and it should have died quietly the way small lies do. It did not die quietly. It was a Saturday in March, mid-morning, the diner half full, and I was at my stool with my coffee and my paperback when the bell over the Bluebird's door jangled and I felt the whole room change temperature. I looked up. A woman had come in, 60-ish, immaculate, sharp-eyed, in a good coat, scanning the diner like a general surveying terrain. And behind her trailed a pleasant-looking man in a sweater who had the specific nervous cheerfulness of a person who has been brought along. And I watched Rosa, 3 feet from me with a coffee pot in her hand, go absolutely white. "Ma'am," Rosa said, in the voice of a woman watching a wave come in that she cannot outrun. So this was Yolanda Marquez, who had apparently decided that if her daughter wouldn't bring the wonderful serious fiancé home, she would simply drive 2 towns over unannounced to meet him, and who had, for reasons that would become horribly clear, brought along a backup in the form of Raphael, a perfectly nice dentist whose mother played cards with Yolanda and who had been floated as a candidate roughly 900 times. Yolanda swept Rosa into an embrace and held her out at arm's length and said, warm and merciless, "Surprise, mija. I could not wait 1 more month to meet him. Where is he? Is he working today? You said he comes here." And I watched Rosa's mind race behind her eyes, watched her open her mouth with no lie ready, watched the whole small, careful piece she'd bought with that fib start to collapse in real time, her mother's face beginning to shift from delight toward the first flicker of suspicion, the suspicion that would confirm every worry, that would mean poor Rosa, still alone, still lying about it. And here's lovely Raphael. Why not give Raphael a chance? And then Rosa turned and picked up my coffee cup off the counter and set it back down in front of me on a fresh napkin. And under the saucer, pressed flat, was a note torn from her order pad, and in fast, desperate handwriting it said, "Please pretend to be my fiancé right now." I have thought about that moment a great deal since. Because I could have done a lot of things. I could have frozen. I could have laughed. I could have been a decent, sensible, cowardly man and slid off that stool and let a stranger's problem stay a stranger's problem. But I looked up from the note, and I found Rosa's eyes, and I saw in them the exact thing I saw in the mirror every morning. A person standing in the wreckage of a plan, bracing to be pitied, and something in me that had been face down in the dirt for 8 months stood up. I put the note in my pocket, I stood off the stool, and I put on the warmest smile I owned, the one I used to use on customers who came in 10 minutes before closing, and I said, "You must be Rosa's mother. She has your eyes." Yolanda Marquez turned the full force of her attention on me like a lighthouse. "And you are?" "Wes," I said, and I put my arm around Rosa's shoulders. Easy. Like I'd done it 1,000 times, and I felt her lean into me with the desperate gratitude of a person who has just been thrown a rope. "Wes Turner, I'm the wonderful, serious man she keeps not bringing home. Which is my fault, honestly. I get shy about the family thing. It's a real pleasure, Mrs. Marquez. She talks about you constantly." Now here's the thing nobody tells you about pretending. You'd think it would feel like lying. It didn't. It felt like the first true thing I'd done in a year. Yolanda grilled me for 45 minutes over a booth and 3 refills, and I found, to my own astonishment, that I was good at this, that some warm, improvising muscle I'd let go slack was suddenly firing on all cylinders. "How did you meet?" She dropped a book, I told her, right here in the diner, a beat-up copy of a novel I loved, and I picked it up and we argued about the ending for an hour and I never left. "When did you know?" "First refill," I said, and Rosa laughed, the real laugh, surprised out of her, and I felt it land somewhere in my chest and take root. And Doc Kowalski, God bless that woman, materialized at the booth halfway through and said, dry as toast, "Oh, these two. Can't keep them apart." He's here every morning making cow eyes over that counter. It's frankly bad for business," which was such a perfect, load-bearing lie that I nearly proposed to Dot on the spot. Raphael the dentist, sensing the terrain, made a graceful early exit. Yolanda left 2 hours later, mostly satisfied, dabbing her eyes, having extracted a promise that Wes and Rosa would come to the family's big Easter gathering the following weekend so the whole clan could meet the man at last. And the second the door jangled shut behind her, Rosa collapsed into the booth across from me and put her face in her hands and said, "Oh my God. Oh my God. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." I panicked. I grabbed the nearest kind face and "You must think I'm insane." "I think," I said, "that was the most fun I've had in 8 months, and I'd like it noted that I nailed the How We Met story on no notice." She laughed into her hands, and then she looked up, and the tired, real smile was there, aimed right at me, and she said, "Why did you do it? You don't even know me." And I said, "Because you looked exactly how I feel every morning, bracing to be pitied. I figured one of us should get a day off from it." She was quiet a second. Then she said, "There's a family Easter now. That I've roped you into, in front of 30 Marqueses. Then we'd better get our story straight," I said. "Fake fiancés should at least agree on their anniversary. That was supposed to be the end of it. A favor, a laugh, a story we'd tell. It was not the end of it, because the lie had a family Easter attached, and so we started meeting after her shifts to, as she put it, build our lore, and the building of our lore turned out to be the best evenings I'd had since the city. We'd sit in the closed diner after Dot went home, Rosa refilling our coffee out of habit, and we'd invent a history and end up telling each other the real one instead. She told me about the fiancé who left, the specifics, how he'd done it 2 weeks before the wedding with a text message and a moving van, how the whole town had watched, how she'd told her mother she'd met someone new mostly, so her mother would stop looking at her like a broken thing. I told her about the dog-eared page, the shop I'd built and lost, how I hadn't been able to open a single one of the boxes in Ray's garage because opening them meant admitting they weren't going back on any shelves. We were, I realized somewhere in the second week, 2 people who had each been left holding the wreckage of a plan, teaching each other that the wreckage wasn't the whole story. Those after hours turned into the thing I looked forward to all day. She'd flip the sign to closed, and we'd sit in a back booth with the big overhead lights off and just the kitchen light on, and we'd draft what she called the official record, an actual sheet of paper, where we wrote down our fake milestones so we wouldn't contradict each other in front of 30 Marqueses, first date, favorite restaurant, the song. Except the drafting kept derailing into the true version. Our fake first date was a picnic by the reservoir. Our real first conversation, she reminded me, was me correcting her pronunciation of an author's name and her threatening to spit in my coffee. We decided our song was something sweeping and romantic for the family, and then spent 20 minutes discovering our actual mutual favorite was a ridiculous novelty tune from the 80s we both knew every word to, and she laughed so hard at that she slid halfway under the table, and I sat there watching a woman I was pretending to be engaged to wipe her eyes in an empty diner and thought, with a quiet lurch, oh no. One night she asked me why I hadn't opened a single box of the books, and I told her the truth, that opening them meant they were really just boxes now and not a shop, and she was quiet a while and then said, "You know what I think? I think you're scared that if you unpack them here it means you stayed, and staying feels like losing. But Wes, some things you carry around unopened for years aren't failures. They're just waiting for the right shelf." I didn't have an answer for that. I filed it in the drawer with the other things I wasn't brave enough to want. She started saving me the window stool without being asked. I started bringing her the good paperbacks I thought she'd like, dog-eared to the parts worth arguing about. Neither of us called it anything. We had, after all, a signed official record that clearly stated we were only pretending. The trouble was that the pretend leaked out of the diner and into the town, and the town, being a small one, ran with it. We had to keep up appearances in public, which meant Rosa's hand in mine walking down Main Street, which meant me showing up to her softball league game and cheering like a fool, which meant 100 tiny performances that got harder and harder to remember were performances. The pharmacist congratulated me on the engagement, and I said thank you before I remembered there wasn't one. Ray asked me, carefully, over breakfast one morning, whether this Rosa business was as pretend as I kept insisting, because I'd been humming, and I hadn't hummed since before the shop closed. And I didn't have an answer that survived contact with his face. And one evening she needed a dress hemmed for Easter, and I sat on the floor of her little apartment holding pins while she stood on a chair, and it was so absurdly domestic, so much like a life, that we both went quiet at the same moment, and neither of us made a joke to break it. And that silence scared me more than anything had in a year, because I could have lived in it. We had, I want to stress, a signed official record. It was not holding up well. The Easter gathering was a triumph and a disaster, in that order. 30 Marqueses descended on a church hall with enough food for 100, and I was passed around like a prize. And I held babies and lost at cards to great aunts and complimented a potato salad so sincerely that its maker teared up. An uncle cornered me by the drinks and interrogated me about my intentions and my credit score with equal seriousness, and I somehow charmed my way clear of both. Rosa's little cousins decided I was a jungle gym within the hour. Somebody's abuelo told me a 40-minute story about a mule that I did not follow one word of and enjoyed enormously. And the strange thing, the thing that snuck up on me between the potato salad and the mule, was that I wasn't performing anymore. Somewhere in that loud, warm hall full of people who decided to love me on Rosa's say-so, I'd stopped acting like a man who belonged and started. Terrifyingly to feel like one. Rosa watched me do it with an expression I couldn't read, and at one point in the afternoon her grandmother took my face in 2 soft hands and said, this one you keep," and Rosa had to go outside for air. And then, late in the day, sitting in a folding chair with a paper plate, watching Rosa laugh in a crowd of people who loved her, I felt the pretend fall away entirely and something real and terrifying take its place, and I understood I had a problem, which was that I was no longer pretending, and had not been for some time. The disaster came in the parking lot. Yolanda caught me alone by my truck, and being nobody's fool, said, gently, "You are good for her, Wes, better than the last one by a country mile. So I will only ask you this once. My daughter has been left before, badly, in front of everyone. If you are not serious, if this is not real, you walk away now, tonight, before Easter, before I plan a party, before she falls the rest of the way. Because I will forgive a man for many things, but not for teaching my Rosa a second time that love is a thing that leaves." Are we clear? And I stood in that parking lot with a woman looking into my soul, and every honest thing in me wanted to say it's real. It stopped being pretend weeks ago, and the old catalogued failure in me, the word temporary I'd built a whole man out of, opened its mouth first, and I said, "We're clear, Mrs. Marquez," which was not a yes, and she heard that it was not a yes, and her face closed a little, and she nodded and walked away, and I drove home to Ray's garage full of boxes I couldn't open and lay awake understanding that I was about to do the thing I always do. 2 days later the escape arrived, the way it always does, exactly when a coward needs it. My old business partner from the city called with an offer, a group opening a new bookshop cafe downtown, real backing this time, real money behind it, and they wanted me to run it, to come back and do the thing I loved in the place that had beaten me, to erase the failure and be Wes Turner the success again instead of Wes Turner who sleeps in his uncle's spare room and fake dates a waitress. It was everything I'd told everyone I was waiting for. It was the proof. And I heard myself on the phone start saying yes. I told Rosa the next morning at the counter, and I dressed it up as kindness the way I always do. I told her I'd gotten a real opportunity back in the city, and that it was probably for the best anyway, because this had gotten complicated, and she deserved a real fiancé and not a washed-up guy playing house between failures. And that I'd tell her mother the engagement fell through gently, take the blame, be the villain, let Rosa off clean. "You deserve the real thing, Rosa," I said, believing I was being noble. "Not a regrouping man with a garage full of dead books. Let me get out of your way before I make it worse." And Rosa set down the coffee pot very carefully and looked at me with a hurt so clean it stopped my heart and said, "There it is. I wondered when you'd run. Everybody's got a moving van. Huh, his was just a text. Yours is a bookshop." And she walked into the kitchen and didn't come back out, and I left money on the counter and went home to pack, because that's what I do. I leave first. I call it kindness. I've got a whole man built out of it. Doc Kowalski found me 2 days later loading boxes into the rented truck in Ray's driveway. She hadn't been invited. Dot does not require invitations. She stood at the end of the driveway with her arms crossed over her apron, and she said, "So you're really doing it. The city again. It's a real opportunity, Dot. I'm sure it is," she said. "Let me tell you what else is real. That girl has poured your coffee every morning for 4 months and given you the smile she doesn't give the room, and I've watched a dead man come back to life on that stool 1 refill at a time, and I've watched her do the same, and now you're telling me you're driving back to the place that broke you, so you can prove to a city that never once thought about you that you're not a failure. You want to talk about failure, West Turner? Failure isn't the bookshop closing. Businesses close. Failure is a man so scared of being left that he leaves first every time and calls it dignity and drives off from the one table in the world that saved him a seat. She let that sit. Then she said quieter, she didn't grab the nearest kind face that Saturday. There were 9 people in my diner. She grabbed you. Out of all of them, in the worst moment of her month, the person she trusted to be gentle with her in a corner was you. That's not pretend, son. That's the realest thing anybody's said about you in years, and you're about to leave it in my driveway. Now I'm going back to work. Your coffee's getting cold, and so is your nerve. And she walked off down the road, 5 feet of apron in truth, and I stood there with a box of dead books in my arms and understood that she was completely, entirely right. I did not finish loading the truck. I put the boxes back in the garage, all of them, and for the first time in 8 months, I opened one, and I sat on the floor of Ray's garage the way I'd sat on the floor of my empty shop. Except this time, I wasn't burying a dream. I was digging one up. I lifted the books out one at a time, and they still smelled like my old shop, like paper and dust, and the whole life I'd told myself was over, and I remembered every reason I'd loved it, and I understood that Rosa had been right in the empty diner weeks before. I hadn't been carrying around a failure. I'd been carrying around a thing that was waiting for the right shelf, and I'd been too scared to admit the right shelf might be here, in the town I swore I'd escape, because staying felt like losing, and I'd rather call myself temporary forever than call myself home and be wrong. Sitting there in my hands was a beautiful worn hardback and about 100 more like it, and I thought about the empty storefront next door to the Bluebird that had been shuttered for 2 years, the one with the good window and the high tin ceiling, and I thought for the first time since the city, not I have to get back, but what if I built it here? Where the coffee's warm, and the town knows my name, and there's a woman 1 door down who gave me the smile she doesn't give the room. I called the city back, and I told them no. And then I did the bravest thing I've done in my adult life, which was to walk into the Bluebird Diner the next morning and sit at my stool like always, heart going like a jackhammer, and wait for Rosa to come pour my coffee. She almost didn't. She saw me and stopped, and Dot, behind the counter, very gently pushed the coffee pot into her hands and gave her a look, and Rosa came down the counter with her chin up and her walls all the way up, and she poured my cup without a word and set it down and turned to go. And under the saucer was a note torn from an order pad, in my handwriting. She stopped. She saw it. She slid it out and unfolded it, and it said, "Please pretend to be my fiancé right now." She looked up at me, and her eyes were bright and furious and hoping all at once, and I stood off the stool in the half-full diner and I said it loud enough for Dot and the regulars and God to hear. I turned the truck around. I told the city no. That opportunity I dressed up as kindness so I could run before you left me first, I turned it down. Because Dot Kowalski informed me in my uncle's driveway that I'm a coward, which I am, and that you didn't grab the nearest kind face that Saturday. You grabbed me, out of a whole room. And that's the realest thing anyone said about me since I drove home a failure. So here's the truth, Rosa. No pretend in it. I don't want to fake being your fiancé for your mother. I want to be it, for real, badly, for me. I want to open a bookshop in the dead storefront next door so I can walk over here every morning for the rest of my life and drink coffee I can't justify and read to you across this counter. I stopped pretending weeks ago. I was just too scared to say so. Marry me for real, or don't, but either way I'm not leaving. I'm done being temporary. I want to be your regular. The whole diner had gone silent. Rosa stood there with the note in her hand and tears standing in her eyes, and she said, shaking, "You told my mother we're clear." In the parking lot, she told me, "You had the chance to say it was real, and you said we're clear." "I know," I said. "And it's the worst thing I ever said, and I've been sick about it since. Because it was real then and it's real now, and I was too much of a coward to. Wes, say it out loud." And I, "Wes," Rosa said. And she set down the coffee pot, and she came around the end of the counter, and she stopped in front of me close as that first note, and she said, "Shut up and be my fiancé for real." And she kissed me. And the whole Bluebird came apart at the seams, the regulars whooping and Dot's sharp triumphant whistle cutting over the top of it, and somewhere in the middle of it my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that just said, "From Yolanda," who had clearly been kept fully informed by Dot the entire time. Finally. "I like this one. Do not mess it up. Ma'am, we didn't rush the rest, though the town rushed it for us, because a small town loves nothing on this earth more than a diner counter proposal it can retell for 30 years. I signed the lease on the dead storefront next to the Bluebird that spring, and I opened all the boxes at last, and the second chapter. That's what I named it. And yes, everyone groaned. And yes, I kept it. Opened its doors in June, a little bookshop with a coffee counter and a reading chair by the window, one door down from the diner, where a waitress once handed a washed-up stranger the best thing that ever happened to him under a saucer. The whole town turned out for the opening. Ray built the shelves himself, wouldn't take a dime for it. And when we set the first books on them, he cleared his throat a lot and blamed the sawdust. Dot catered it with pie and told everyone within earshot that she'd made the whole thing happen, which was true. Rosa cut the ribbon, and her mother drove 2 towns over to be there and cried into a napkin and told me the shop was almost good enough to make up for the parking lot, almost. Rosa still works the morning shift at the Bluebird, because she loves Dot and she loves the regulars, and every morning she pours my coffee and slides it across the counter, and about once a week there's still a note under the saucer, from her or from me, and they don't say pretend anymore. Her mother comes to visit once a month and has never once, not one single time, let me forget the words were clear, and she says them with such wicked delight that I've come to understand it as a form of love, which in the Marquez family it very much is. I asked Rosa once, late, why she picked me that Saturday out of a whole diner, and she said, "You were the only one in here who looked like he knew what it felt like to have a plan die on him. Everybody else in that room would have pitied me. I knew you wouldn't. I didn't grab the nearest kind face, Wes. I grabbed the only one that had been where I was. I think about that a lot, standing behind the counter of a bookshop I never planned to build, in a town I swore I'd escape, one door down from the woman who saved me a seat. About how the thing I'd cataloged as the end of my story, the failure, the crawling home, turned out to be chapter 1 of the only story that ever mattered. Ray comes by the shop most afternoons now and sits in the window chair and reads and doesn't say much, and I've noticed he stopped keeping his whole life in boxes, too, somewhere along the way, like maybe watching me stay gave him permission. Funny how that works. You unpack one box, and it turns out you gave somebody else the nerve to unpack theirs. So here's what I've got for you, if you've read this far into the tale of a man who almost drove off from his own life. If you've built a whole self out of the word temporary because it's safer than the word failed. If you keep a moving van idling in your heart so nobody can leave you first, if there's a note somebody's trying to hand you that you're too scared to unfold, this is me telling you, from behind the counter of my second chapter, unfold it. Turn the truck around. Let yourself be somebody's regular. You have no idea whose whole life is trying to hand you a seat. I almost drove off from mine to go prove something to a city that never thought about me once. Don't be as slow as I was. And if you'd stay a while longer with us, subscribe and let the next story keep you company. There's always a warm light on here at lamplight, and the kettle's on, and there's a note under your saucer, if you're brave enough to turn it over.